In England and Wales, the word is very much cultivated because, I suppose, of the consequences of having Protestantism reign for now a good number of centuries. And so grave inscriptions are very well thought out. They try to put into one or two lines a big part of a whole life. But quite often they are scriptural, deliberately chosen, and one might find a little damsel who dies at the age of 6 or 7, and what will be the verse? Something like this in the Old English: not dead, but sleepeth. Indeed, the word cemetery means a sleeping place, a dormitory. It's the koimeterion, and to sleep, to go to bed, is to recline in Greek, and that gives us the word cemetery. They are, therefore, dozing, awaiting the final trump. Now, in the month of November, we do well to anticipate that final call, when from the tombs they and we will all arise. Now, you know from your catechism that at the separation of body and soul, there is already the particular judgment that no one else knows about. It's between the soul and its maker. But the catechism tells us, because of the great wisdom and providence of our God, there is also the general judgment at the end of time, because what we do has an impact on others, and others have a right to know. So at that point, the books are opened and people learn a lot. It's not just, therefore, a private affair. We drag each other down or bring each other up. I may have told you before about the case of this conversation I had years ago in Italy with a good young fervent priest of the Vincentian order. He was talking about a prie-dieu, that's a kneeler that he knew about and that had got to Italy discreetly and in a hurry. It was from Paris or somewhere in France, and they wanted to keep it hushed up. There had been some lady who had had an affair, and that she wasn't free. I think she was married or something of that nature, and she had this liaison with a young man who was in love with her, and they were misbehaving. But she died without having a chance to get her act together. And he was upset about this, and actually, believe it or not, was in prayer on this prie-dieu. And what was his shock when this, his friend, came before him, blazing, and left a trace of that blaze by putting her hand on the prie-dieu, which therefore was sizzled, and to this day, get it out of here quickly was what the reaction of the church authorities was, lest it be known, especially the name. And so it found its way to Italy. But the point is this: she said something to him. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here. We can bring each other down. In that context, one sees what being a success or a flop is. Do you think that those who make much noise in this world are great successes? Look at the end of many a great success. A political figure, a dictator, oftentimes a bullet. Look, on the other hand, at a hidden housewife who had no glory in this world, but died with all her family around, with prayer in the air, which was a success, which was a flop. My friends, one day we too will be in the balance, and alone in the scales we will wonder whether we are a success or a flop before the eyes of our King. And at that point, no amount of noise, no number of followers on internet, no amount of applause at funerals can help us to go the right way in the scales. Only what we are, alone. As Blaise Pascal put it, on meurt seul, one dies alone. And that was said in the context of the ritual of dying in France at the time, when one had to ask forgiveness of family members, they were all there, and so on. On meurt seul. In 1883, this word came from the beyond, and if anyone is still interested in getting hold of this, we have a few there in the sacristy. I mentioned it last time. In the context of this month of November, I got this Journey of the Soul printed. And I told you, by the way, that the printing press caught fire in Drogheda. Another year gone into eternity, says the departed soul, the nun. Thus do they pass, one after another. Day succeeds day, until the one that puts a term to this short life on earth and begins the long life of eternity. Make good use of every moment you have. Now remember that word later on in the day when you're about to spend an hour before a screen. Every moment comes once only. And when we're in the scale, at that point, we will see the value of our moments. Lightweight souls have lightweight moments on their copybook. Heavyweights before the Lord are dense with prayer and charity, not hours of googling and goggling. Each one of them, that's each moment, can win you heaven and spare you purgatory. And by the way, that's one thing that comes out of both this one and the last one in it, the one from hell. One moment can tip that balance. One moment can have power over ever and ever and ever. It's the moment of death. And indeed, the preparatory moments, because grace is always pulling. Each of your actions carried out beneath the regard of Jesus will give you one more degree of glory for heaven. And as the soul of the nun is getting purified, she is giving these hints more and more, getting the other one to look upward and to realize that the game is very serious with regard to doing the will of God and getting to that degree that the Lord had prepared for the soul. It applies to each one here, because each one here is here by choice. You're lucky to be in an assembly where everyone is here wanting to be here and coming quite often from a distance. There is quality of prayer and listening here, and each one here is being challenged. God wants each one here to reach the level of glory prepared. Don't switch off or get stagnated. Move on. Increased in proportion, each of these acts of a perfect life forms a chain of love, which binds the soul ever more closely to the one it loves. And then, when we're ready, he calls. When the final link has been formed, Jesus then breaks the feeble moorings that still hold the soul, now full of merits, bound to the body with which it was united on earth. Then it goes on to the bliss that awaits it. I mentioned before Victor Hugo, reportedly the greatest French poet, alas. But he has his greatness too, and he has this poem on the separation of the body and the soul. And the final line is, as the soul leaves the body that is served so well, Je suis damné! I am damned. This hit me when still not yet a priest, but still in formation, when I'd been transferred to Italy in urgency from here. And the prior took us to see where St. Catherine had moved, worked, prayed, and suffered in the city, where later I was to be ordained in the cathedral. And opposite the cathedral is the old hospital, Maria della Scala, where she had spent hours watching the dead as they died. And there was a little niche there where she would get a few winks of sleep on a stone. And as we came out of the hospital, the old hospital, there was a real skull. And there was an inscription in Old Italian beneath it. Come tu sei, fui ancor io, come io sono, sarai ancor tu. As you are, so too was I. As I am, so too will you be. And it looked at me, and I looked at it, and I understood him perfectly. Afterwards, the prior took us to a cafe near to get some refreshment before going on, and I got hold of the serviette, the paper serviette used to wipe one's mouth after a cup of coffee, and I wrote on it this which I'll give to you, my word to the skull, and its word to me. Certain truths do not change. Indeed, the monks of old used to have a skull near to them, or even a skeleton. When I was studying classics laboratories, I was living for the first and third year with the Carmelites, and the prior had a skeleton in his room. It was behind the door, and if one went to see him, it would move. And it had a name. It was Rudolph. And the prior would talk to Rudolph. He would say, Rudolph, I'll be with you one of these days, Rudolph. With regard to the moment of death, it was taken very seriously by those who went before us. And don't think that we have made it easier to get into heaven than they did. It's just that we presume more than they did. And the question is, are we presuming too much? After all, if God is God, he doesn't need modernizing. So these got it right, and they knew what it meant. This is in British Isles, the day when we remember those who fell in the two great wars. There'd be a pause of 2 minutes at 11 o'clock throughout England, and there'd be ceremonies in public places, the cenotaph. And people mentally in those 2 minutes do recall things. A lot is talked about because, after all, it left a gash on England, Wales, and Scotland, and also even Ireland. The flower of the nation went and didn't come back. But there was sanctity out there, and death was very serious. Why? They had some knowledge of the risk and the hope. And the chaplain was very, very, very important. There was sanctity on both sides, my friends. I went to occupy a trench from which the Germans had lately been evicted. It was quite dark, and on entering the trench at the head of my party, I heard someone talking in a low voice. I crept forward as quietly as I could and saw what I imagined must be a doctor supporting the head of a wounded man. I called upon him to surrender, and he held up a crucifix towards me. So I knew he must be a priest. The priest was giving absolution to a dying Bavarian. Remember now, he's in conquered trenches. He's out of bounds and therefore officially an enemy, who expired a few minutes later. I went up to the priest, whoever could not understand English or French. I knew very little German, only a few words in fact, so we fell back on Latin, in which time we held a short and very halting conversation. As far as I could make out, he said that the Germans were suffering much from sickness, and he disliked the Prussians most cordially. Eventually, I allowed him to return to the German trenches, which I expect and hope that he reached in safety. The courage of the German priest in remaining to give absolution to his dying countrymen surpasses anything I have heard myself in the course of the present war. And on he goes. This is what saving a soul meant. I go on. A story is told of how a captain of artillery, who in peacetime fills the role of curé, said Mass among the ruins of a church from which his battery had just expelled the enemy after putting one of their batteries out of action. Now notice that these are competent in their domain. My prof of theology in France, in the monastery, was a colonel of the reserve, and he was still occasionally having to do periods of duty. In France, it's a strange kettle of fish, but there were at least 2,000 mobilized priests in the First War. The action began by a rush of French colonial troops under a murderous machine gun fire. They made a dash for 20 yards, dropped, rose again, and, not all of them alas, went forward afresh. It was necessary to take a point of great strategical importance, and things were going rather badly, when suddenly a battery of 75s arrived at full gallop. It was commanded by a gigantic captain of almost ferocious mien, certainly not the kind of man to trifle with. He climbed into a tree and came down after 3 minutes' observation. Then he indicated the range for his battery, and it started work. The result, the 2 German batteries were silenced in quick time. Their fire ceased as if by magic, and the colonials made rapid progress, none of them biting the dust now. The French battery limbered up and drove into what remained of the village in front. The horses were once more tethered, and the gunners, after carefully brushing themselves, vanished into a ruined grange. Here, a strange spectacle presented itself. A stone had been placed upon some empty carriage boxes, and the cartridge boxes, I beg your pardon, and the artillery captain said Holy Mass. The captain's 3 stripes were scarcely hidden by the curé's priestly robe. Nothing was left out of the surface. In a sermon, the curé captain told his listeners, first of all, to pray for all on behalf of whom he was going to say Mass. This Mass, by the way, is for the holy souls in purgatory. I recommend in particular for your prayers the German artillerymen whom we have just destroyed, he said. They performed as followed. All round the village, German marmites were exploding while the captain raised his head for the Benedicat Vos. One cannot adequately describe the impression of this mass, said to an accompaniment of machine gun fire. The effect of this cradle, chanted by the soldiers in the midst of the roar of the cannon, and the sight of this priest, who was giving his blessing but a few moments after sending to another world over 100 Germans with the fire of his battery. My friends, we don't know how long we're here for. What we do know is that one day our skull will be in the form of that one too, and the soul departed will be forever, wherever we have sent it.
Et con spiritu tuo